Welcome to the Veil of Truth, your passport to the stories that matter, globe showing Europe, Africa. I'm thrilled you're here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from around the world. Chapter 1, An Invitation to Ivy Hall. Hercule Poirot was sipping his afternoon tisane in the snug confines of his flat on Whitehaven Mansions when the post arrived. He had just arranged his cut crystal sugar bowl precisely in line with the edge of the tray when his valet, George, stepped into the room bearing a single cream-colored envelope. "A letter, sir," George intoned with his usual unflappable dignity. "Hand-delivered." Poirot accepted it, noting the weight of the paper and the fine embossing. The seal was crimson wax, imprinted with an ivy leaf, a detail that caused his perfectly arched eyebrows to lift slightly. "Ah. This is not a bill, mon ami," Poirot said, holding the envelope delicately between thumb and forefinger. "This is something altogether more interesting." With a silver letter opener shaped like a rapier, he slit the envelope and unfolded the single sheet within. The handwriting was neat, feminine, and purposeful. "My dear Monsieur Poirot, I write to you not only as a former acquaintance but as one in urgent need of your unique talents. Strange things have been occurring at Ivy Hall, things I fear are not easily explained by reason alone. I will not speak of ghosts or superstition, but of an unease that settles in one's bones. I am no longer certain whom I can trust within my own household. Might you do me the honor of visiting us for a few days? It may be nothing at all, and yet I believe someone wishes me harm. With sincere regards, Lady Cecily Ashcombe." Poirot read the letter twice. Then he rose, crossed to his window, and looked out across the autumnal city. The leaves in the park below had turned golden and rust-red. A haze of low mist hung about the Thames. It was a quiet day, too quiet, perhaps. "George," Poirot said without turning, "pack my valise. I shall be travelling to Sussex in the morning." "Very good, sir. Shall I include your travelling moustache comb?" "Naturellement." Ivy Hall lay nestled amidst the rolling Sussex downs, surrounded by yew hedges and aged oaks that whispered in the wind. It was a stately home in the most traditional sense, grand without being vulgar, secluded but not forgotten, and, Poirot noted as the motorcar approached the gates, just weathered enough to whisper secrets. He was met on the drive by Lady Cecily herself. Though in her early 70s, she stood tall, her silver hair elegantly pinned beneath a velvet cloche hat, her walking stick polished to a sheen. "My dear Poirot," she said with a tired smile, taking his gloved hand. "You look precisely as I remember you. Immaculate. Please forgive the lack of ceremony, I'm afraid the atmosphere here is rather strained at present." "You are looking very well, Lady Cecily," Poirot replied gallantly, though he noted the faint tremble in her voice and the lines of worry that marred her otherwise refined face. "But one does not summon Hercule Poirot without good reason, n'est-ce pas?" She gave a wan chuckle. "Indeed. Let me show you in." Inside, the hall was everything Poirot had expected. Oak-paneled walls, ancestral portraits, a sweeping staircase, and the scent of lavender polish and age. A fire crackled in the hearth of the drawing-room as Lady Cecily introduced him to the household. Her nephew Miles Ashcombe was the first. A man in his early 30s, well-dressed and undeniably charming, though Poirot found the charm a touch too deliberate. He had a laugh that echoed loudly and eyes that flicked constantly from person to person. "My dear aunt tells me you're a detective of no small reputation," Miles said, shaking Poirot's hand with force. "I do hope your presence isn't too ominous. Though I confess, a bit of excitement never hurt a country house." Poirot responded with a polite smile. "Sometimes, monsieur, it is better that the excitement remains in the pages of a book." Then there was Miss Eleanor Brent, Lady Cecily's companion. Quiet, almost timid, she possessed the faded grace of someone who once dreamed vividly and now lived carefully. Her hands twisted nervously in her lap, and she avoided Miles' gaze. Dr. Felix Ransome, the local physician, arrived soon after. He was a tall, neat man with a clipped manner of speech and a distant look in his eyes. "Routine call," he explained briskly. "But I'm always happy to be of assistance, Poirot. I've heard much about you." "Then I hope not to disappoint," Poirot replied dryly. The last two members of the household were Giles Merriman, the estate manager, a brooding, stiff-backed man with an unreadable expression, and Vera Henshall, a young maid with wide, anxious eyes and a hesitation in her voice that made Poirot note her immediately. That evening, dinner was served in a formal but subdued fashion. Poirot paid careful attention to the way each guest interacted. Miles dominated the conversation, making veiled jabs at Merriman's old-fashioned values and recounting his exploits in Monte Carlo. Merriman barely responded. Eleanor flinched at loud laughter. Dr. Ransome watched everything with clinical detachment. Lady Cecily sat silent for long stretches, clearly uneasy. When the port was passed and the company began to thin, Poirot stood and excused himself. "A little walk, I think, to take the air." He stepped out into the garden as dusk settled. The wind was rising, and a low mist crept in from the surrounding woods. He followed a gravel path that forked abruptly at a line of hedge. There, to his mild surprise, he discovered a labyrinth, an old hedge maze, its entry marked by crumbling stone lions. The hedges were tall, unkempt, and wild in places. He took a few steps forward, then stopped. "No, no," he murmured, smiling. "This is a place for a more deliberate entry." He turned back toward the house, casting one last glance at the twisting hedges. "A puzzle within a puzzle," he said softly. "Mon Dieu, I believe I shall enjoy this." And somewhere within Ivy Hall, hidden by civility and tradition, a darker truth waited, coiled and ready to strike. Chapter 2, The Uneasy Gathering. The following morning at Ivy Hall dawned grey and listless, with low clouds pressing upon the turrets and gables of the great house like the hand of an unseen giant. From his guest room overlooking the east lawn, Hercule Poirot stood at the window, his moustaches as immaculate as the pressed cuffs of his robe. His sharp eyes studied the landscape, the old ivy-choked well, the topiary animals long past their prime, and, just beyond a hedge, the entrance to the garden labyrinth. The maze again. A symbol, perhaps. An echo of the house itself, a tangle of appearances and secrets. He dressed with his usual meticulous care, choosing a dove-grey suit, a black cravat pin, and a soft felt hat. When he descended the staircase, the scent of toast and tea met him. He made his way to the breakfast room, where a low murmur of conversation greeted him. Lady Cecily sat at the head of the table, buttering a scone with deliberate slowness. To her right was Eleanor Brent, pale and quiet, her cup held close to her chest like a shield. Across from her, Miles Ashcombe lounged in a silk dressing gown, flipping through the Daily Mail, his foot rhythmically tapping beneath the table. "Ah, Monsieur Poirot," Lady Cecily said as he entered, a relieved smile on her lips. "I do hope you slept well." "Like the infant, madam," Poirot replied with a small bow. "Though I confess, my dreams were of corridors that twisted back upon themselves." "Perhaps it is your labyrinth, how do you say, infiltrating the subconscious?" Miles chuckled. "Bit of a legend, that old thing. Built by my grandfather for the amusement of guests. Got lost in it myself once as a boy. Thought I'd starve to death." Lady Cecily offered a faint smile but said nothing. Poirot took a seat and helped himself to porridge. He noted that Dr. Ransome had not yet arrived. Nor had Merriman, the estate manager. Vera, the maid, entered quietly to top up the coffee pot. She looked tired, with dark shadows under her eyes. Poirot watched her with his usual attention to detail. Her movements were quick, but there was a hesitance in her manner, a nervousness in her hands. She avoided Miles entirely. "Vera, would you be so kind as to bring an extra cup for Dr. Ransome?" Lady Cecily asked gently. "Yes, madam," Vera replied, and nearly dropped the cream jug in her haste to comply. When she had gone, Poirot turned to Lady Cecily. "You mentioned in your letter, madam, a sense of unease within the house. Forgive my directness, but I should like to begin by understanding its nature. Has anything specific occurred?" Lady Cecily set down her knife with care. "Not one great event, Monsieur Poirot, but rather, a series of small disturbances. Drawers rifled through. Keys misplaced. A broken vase left on my writing desk without explanation. And once, I found a bottle of laudanum in my tea cabinet, a substance I do not use." "Interesting," Poirot murmured. "And have you spoken to your doctor about this?" At that moment, Dr. Ransome entered, adjusting his gloves and offering a curt nod. "Speak of the devil, eh?" he said dryly, taking the seat beside Eleanor. "Apologies for being late, an elderly patient in the village had a nasty turn." Poirot inclined his head. "And how is the health of Lady Cecily?" "Robust for her age," Dr. Ransome replied without hesitation. "Though I've advised against unnecessary excitement. Sussex winters are not forgiving to women in their 70s. Miles snorted. "Aunt Cecily's not going anywhere. She'll outlive us all." Poirot smiled faintly and changed the subject. "And you, mademoiselle?" he asked Eleanor Brent. "Do you also find the house unsettling?" Eleanor blinked. "Oh, no, not exactly. It's large, of course. Old. Things creak. But it's nothing alarming." Miles gave a lazy grin. "Eleanor has the soul of a poet. She sees ghosts in every corner." Poirot studied the interaction. There was something brittle in Eleanor's silence, and something cruel in Miles' amusement. It was subtle, but the tension between them crackled like a low electric hum beneath the pleasantries. Breakfast came to a close, and the household dispersed. Poirot asked if he might take a walk through the gardens, and Lady Cecily was only too glad to have Vera accompany him to show the way. The morning mist had thickened into a veil of fine drizzle, blurring the outlines of hedges and trees. Vera walked a few paces ahead, glancing over her shoulder occasionally. Her silence was not the comfort of a contented servant, but the kind of quiet born of worry. "You do not enjoy being out here, mademoiselle?" Poirot asked gently. "It's just damp, sir," Vera muttered. "I don't much like the maze. Gives me the shivers. But it is quite beautiful, no? In its own melancholy way." Vera shrugged. "Folk say it's cursed. A gardener once got lost in it for 2 nights back in the war. Some say he never came back the same." Poirot smiled. "You believe in such things?" "No, sir. But I believe people do mad things when they are scared." They reached the entrance to the labyrinth. The hedges loomed high and unruly. Moss coated the stone threshold where the twin lion statues now leaned askew. One of them had lost its head. Poirot stood for a long moment, then stepped just inside. The air within was cooler, as though the walls breathed mist and memory. "I shall return later, mademoiselle," he said. "Alone?" Vera nodded. "If you say so, sir. Just, be careful." Poirot watched her go, then took a few steps deeper into the maze before stopping. He examined the moss underfoot, the damp brick path, and the crumbling mortar between hedge walls. A broken branch caught his eye, fresh, still green at the break. "Ah," he whispered to himself. "This place has been visited recently." He left the maze and returned to the house, passing Giles Merriman near the garden shed. The estate manager gave him a curt nod, eyes unreadable. Inside, Poirot removed his hat and coat with precision and ascended the stairs to his guest room. But as he passed Eleanor's door, he paused. There it was again, that feeling of something unsaid. Secrets behind smiles. Shadows behind words. Poirot had seen it many times before. And tomorrow, he suspected, would be far from uneventful. Chapter 3. A Death in the Labyrinth. The next morning broke cold and eerily quiet, the wind rattling the window panes with nervous fingers. Hercule Poirot, already impeccably dressed, stood by the fireplace in the breakfast room, stirring his coffee with slow precision. Something was wrong. He could feel it, not just in the atmosphere, but in the silence that hung oppressively over Ivy Hall. The household gradually filtered in. Lady Cecily appeared first, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for a piece of toast. Then Eleanor, pale and red-eyed, who offered a thin smile but said nothing. Dr. Ransome followed, his collar slightly crooked and his expression unusually tense. Giles Merriman, the estate manager, arrived with the faint scent of damp soil clinging to his coat. But Miles Ashcombe was absent. "Still abed, perhaps," muttered Merriman, glancing at the clock. "Or, sleeping it off." Lady Cecily gave a sigh. "He came in late last night, very late. I heard him stumbling up the stairs." Eleanor looked up suddenly. I thought I heard a voice outside during the night. Just after midnight. It came from the gardens." Poirot raised an eyebrow. "A voice, mademoiselle?" She hesitated. "A man's voice. Arguing." Then it stopped. "I assumed it was Miles. He was in a dreadful mood after dinner." Before anyone could respond, a scream shattered the morning calm. It came from the garden. Poirot was the first to move, already halfway down the corridor as the others sprang to their feet. They burst out into the chilly air, following the sound to the mouth of the labyrinth. There, just beyond the crumbling stone lions, stood Vera Henshaw, frozen with terror. "He's in there," she gasped. Oh God, he's dead." Poirot entered first. The hedges closed in around him like the ribs of some great beast. The paths twisted, turned, then turned again. But Poirot moved with purpose, his memory serving him well from the previous day. He followed a narrow trail that dipped beneath a broken arch of bramble, and there, at the center, he found the body. Miles Ashcombe lay sprawled on the wet earth, one arm flung over his head. His hair was damp with dew, but the darker stain at the back of his skull told the true tale. Blood had soaked into the moss beneath him. Beside his left hand lay a jagged shard of stone, part of a sundial, Poirot guessed, its edges smeared with red. Poirot knelt. "No pulse," he said softly. "The body is still warm. He cannot have died more than an hour ago." Gudgeon, the local inspector, arrived shortly thereafter, summoned by Lady Cecily in her panic. A thick-set man with a bristling moustache and the permanent look of someone unimpressed by anything finer than pub ale, Gudgeon wasted no time. "Blunt force trauma," he said, prodding the corpse unceremoniously. "Murder, sure enough. But how did the killer get out? Look, only one set of footprints leads in. None out." Poirot nodded, already scanning the scene. The earth was soft from last night's rain. Indeed, only Miles' prints, distinctive from the square heel of his brogues, marked the narrow path. And yet he had not died by his own hand. "There is always another way," Poirot murmured. "One must merely look beyond what is visible." Inspector Gudgeon turned to Vera, who stood trembling at the entrance to the center circle of the maze. "You found the body?" "Yes, sir. I was walking past on my way to the garden shed. I saw a blackbird fly out of the hedge and heard something rustling. I looked in and there he was." "Why were you headed to the shed?" "To get polish for the brass railings. Mr. Merriman said they needed doing today." Merriman, who had just arrived, frowned. "I told her that 2 days ago. Today she was meant to help clean the east wing windows." Gudgeon narrowed his eyes. "So which is it, girl?" I must have got it wrong, sir." Poirot intervened gently. "She may have been confused by the schedule, but let us not rush to judgment. Mademoiselle Vera is frightened, not guilty." He moved closer to the body. Something glinted in the mud. Bending carefully, he extracted it using his handkerchief, a broken cufflink, silver with a small blue gem at its center. Poirot slipped it into his pocket, unnoticed by the others. "Inspector," he said, "may I suggest that we leave the body until your photographer arrives? I should also like to speak to the household. There are questions that must be answered." Gudgeon gave a grunt of assent. Though I still say it's Eleanor Brent. That girl's too quiet for her own good. And she's got motive." Miles was next in line for the estate, was he not? Poirot did not respond immediately. Instead, he stared at the entrance of the maze. Something about the geometry of the hedges, the narrowness of the paths, and the bramble arch gnawed at his thoughts. "Let us return to the house," he said at last. "There is much still hidden in this puzzle." Back in the drawing room, the household gathered once more, their faces pale, their expressions tense. "Murder," Lady Cecily whispered. "Here? In my home? What has this place become?" Poirot stood by the fireplace, hands clasped behind his back. "Madam, may I ask, when did you last revise your will?" There was a pause. "About 6 months ago. After a bout of pneumonia that made me reflect." "And who was to inherit?" "Miles. If he remained unmarried by the time of my death, Eleanor would receive a portion. I had hoped they might rekindle their engagement. That was always the intention, you see." Poirot nodded gravely. Gudgeon spoke up. "Then the girl had motive after all. If Miles dies, she gains." Eleanor stood, shaking. "That's not true. I wanted nothing from him. He treated me terribly. Everyone here knows it." "That will be enough," Poirot said quietly. "I shall speak to each of you privately." One by one, the household filed out, leaving Poirot once more alone with the crackling fire and the bitter scent of murder. He reached into his pocket and withdrew the broken cufflink. "Every puzzle," he whispered, turning it over in his fingers, "leaves behind a trail. And Hercule Poirot, he always finds the trail." Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the eaves like a warning. And in the center of the ivy maze, death lingered. Chapter 4: The Web Tightens. The drawing room of Ivy Hall had once been a place of repose and civility. Now it bore the uneasy quiet of a courtroom awaiting judgment. The curtains hung heavily, filtering in only a pale sliver of sunlight. A low fire hissed in the hearth, though it did little to dispel the chill that had taken root in the house since the murder of Miles Ashcombe. Poirot sat with his fingertips pressed together, a gesture familiar to those who knew his methods. It was a position of thought, of calculation. Beside him stood Inspector Gudgeon, flipping through his notes with the haphazard energy of a man who preferred actions to theories. "So," Gudgeon said, scratching his chin, "we've got a dead man with no clear weapon, a maze with no footprints, and a household full of secrets. Where do we begin?" Poirot raised a single finger. "We begin, mon ami, where the motive lies. Always." He turned to Lady Cecily, who sat on a stiff-backed chair as if bracing herself for a blow. "Madam, you said Miles was to inherit Ivy Hall, yes? But only if he remained unmarried." Lady Cecily nodded, a weary sigh escaping her lips. "Yes. It was my husband's stipulation. He wanted to keep the estate in the family. Eleanor was to inherit only if Miles died before marriage. We never changed it." Poirot's eyes flicked to Eleanor, who stood by the mantelpiece, arms crossed tightly. "Mademoiselle Brent, when was the last time you and Monsieur Ashcombe spoke privately?" Eleanor hesitated. 2 days ago. He wanted to make amends, he said. But I didn't believe him. He was charming, always, but it was a charm he wielded like a knife. He only wanted money. Yet he stood to gain plenty without troubling you again, Poirot observed softly. So why return to you? Eleanor met his gaze, her voice suddenly firmer. Because I recently changed my will too. I'd left him something, once. But I struck his name out. He was furious. Said I owed him. Curious, Poirot murmured. Tell me, why did you change your will? I couldn't bear the idea of him benefiting from me, not after everything. I left it to a children's hospital in Brighton. There was silence for a moment. Gudgeon cleared his throat. So she had motive. An opportunity? Poirot countered. We cannot be certain. Let us examine others. He turned to Dr. Ransome, seated stiffly with arms folded. Doctor, you were friendly with Miles. Ransome's lip twitched. I was polite. He was Lady Cecily's nephew. I had no personal liking for him. I found him reckless, manipulative, and dishonest. And yet you continue to treat him. I treat everyone under this roof. Poirot nodded. Did you argue with him recently? Ransome hesitated. I told him to leave Eleanor alone. That's all. Nothing more. Poirot leaned back. And do you always wear those cufflinks? The doctor blinked. No. Not always. Why? No reason, just an observation, Poirot said mildly, concealing the broken cufflink he had discovered near the body. He then turned his attention to Giles Merriman, the taciturn estate manager. Merriman stood by the bookcase, his face lined with unreadable shadows. You did not get on with Miles, I understand. Merriman snorted. Few did. He mocked tradition, spent what wasn't his, and treated people like tools. Did you ever threaten him? No, Merriman said flatly. Though I thought of it. And you were where this morning at dawn? In the tool shed. Fixing the south gate latch. Ask Vera, she saw me coming in. Vera nodded nervously. Yes, sir. I passed him just before I saw the body. Poirot allowed silence to settle again. He studied the room, his gaze drifting across each person, noting their expressions, their posture, their discomfort. Madam, he said at last to Lady Cecily, you mentioned earlier that drawers were disturbed, that laudanum was found in your tea cabinet. Did you report this to anyone other than myself? No, she said. I didn't want to cause alarm. And yet someone was alarmed, Poirot said, standing and pacing. Enough to act rashly. Enough to kill. Still sounds like the companion to me, muttered Gudgeon. She had the motive, she heard voices, and she's been as nervous as a rabbit since you arrived. But sometimes the nervousness, Inspector, is the sign not of guilt, but of fear. Gudgeon frowned. Fear of what? Of the truth, Poirot said quietly. He walked to the window and gazed out across the frost-covered garden. Miles Ashcombe had enemies, yes. But more than that, he had control over people. Control he used cruelly. There are bruises beneath the surface in this house. Emotional wounds. And some, I think, more literal. He turned to Vera. Mademoiselle, forgive me. But when Miles approached you last week, what did he want? Vera's eyes widened. I didn't tell you that. No, Poirot said gently, but others did. Vera looked down, twisting her apron in her hands. He cornered me in the west corridor. Said he'd make me regret it if I told anyone about the letters he'd been burning. Poirot tilted his head. Letters? Old ones, I think. He took them from Lady Cecily's study one night. I saw him. He told me to keep quiet. Poirot's voice was soft. And did you? I was scared. Poirot gave a small nod. And you are not the only one, I think. The fire popped in the grate. Outside, the wind stirred the dry ivy that clung to the stone walls of the house. Poirot stepped toward the door. I will take another walk in the garden, he said, buttoning his coat. There is something that has not left my mind. Something about the labyrinth. You're not going in there again, you? Lady Cecily asked, her brow furrowed. Mais oui, madam. That is where the story began. And I believe, with careful thought and little grey cells, it is where it may be unravelled. And with that, he left the drawing-room, his footsteps steady as ever, the lines of his immaculate coat sharp against the fading light. Behind him, the web of suspicion continued to tighten. But Poirot already saw the pattern emerging, delicate, deliberate, and deadly. Chapter 5, Shadows in the Fog. The fog returned with a vengeance that afternoon, rolling in thick from the downs like the slow exhale of some brooding creature. It clung to the lawns of Ivy Hall and curled around its chimneys, blurring the edges of hedges and statues until the entire garden resembled a faded photograph. Poirot moved quietly through the swirling mist, gloved hands tucked behind his back, his gait measured, his mind alight with possibilities. The labyrinth loomed once again before him, its gnarled entrance crouching behind the lion statues, whose weather-worn faces seemed more mournful than ever. But this time, Poirot did not enter. He circled instead, eyes darting between hedges, earth, and stone. He was searching, not for what was visible, but for what had been deliberately concealed. The truth, Poirot knew, often hid just beyond the reach of the obvious. He soon found what he was looking for. At the far side of the maze, behind a half-rotted trellis where ivy had overtaken brick, lay the gardener's shed. It was an old, squat structure, sagging at the sides, its wooden door held shut with a loop of rusted chain. To most, it appeared abandoned. But Poirot, with his unerring eye, saw the fine line of disturbed earth near the door frame, the faint smear of mud on the handle. He bent and examined the chain, loosely fastened, the padlock barely clicked into place. He removed it easily. Inside, the air smelled of damp leaves and old oil. Gardening tools lined the back wall, shears, hose, a cracked wheelbarrow. But it was the floorboards that drew Poirot's attention. One plank, near the rear wall, had been pried loose and replaced with less care than the others. Kneeling, Poirot lifted it. Beneath, nestled in the dirt, was a small bundle wrapped in oilskin. He unfolded it to reveal a pair of gloves, leather, dark brown, smudged with something darker still, and a woman's earring, delicate, pearl drop, its clasp bent slightly as if torn off. "Ah," Poirot murmured. "The hidden things always reveal the truth." He pocketed the earring and returned the gloves, covering the bundle once more. For now, it was enough to know they were there. Back at the hall, Vera Henshall was scrubbing the hearth tiles in the front parlor when Poirot approached her. "Mademoiselle," he said gently, "I found something in the garden. An earring. May I show it to you?" She looked up sharply. "Why would you?" But then Poirot opened his palm, revealing the small pearl drop. Her breath caught. I lost it last week," she whispered. "In the hallway. Or I thought I did." Poirot said nothing. "You don't think she began, then trailed off, panic rising in her throat. "I think, mademoiselle, that someone is trying very hard to ensure that blame does not fall where it should," Poirot replied. "And in doing so, they have made mistakes." He gave her a small, reassuring nod. "Courage. That is what is needed now." Later that day, Lady Cecily called Poirot to her study. She was seated at a bureau, a small stack of correspondence before her. A decanter of sherry sat untouched nearby. "I must ask, Monsieur Poirot," she said quietly, "do you believe someone in this house truly meant to kill me?" Poirot took a seat across from her. "Yes, madam," he said calmly. "I do." Her fingers trembled against her glass. "Then Miles, his death was a mistake." Poirot hesitated. "Not necessarily. It may be that both were targets, for different reasons." He leaned forward. "Madam, you found a bottle of laudanum among your tea. That was not carelessness. That was preparation. I believe someone intended to weaken or incapacitate you. Perhaps even to kill." Lady Cecily shivered. "But why?" "For the inheritance, perhaps. Or something older. A grudge. A secret." Poirot glanced at the fire, then back at her. "May I ask, did you have other family? Apart from Miles?" Lady Cecily nodded slowly. "My husband had an affair, many years ago. A child resulted. He never acknowledged it. I learned of it only after his death." "Did you know the child's name?" She hesitated. "Gerald. I believe. Gerald Ashcombe. But I never pursued it." Poirot sat back. "How very interesting." That evening, the household gathered for supper in the dining room, though little was eaten. The room felt colder than before, the air thicker. Conversation faltered quickly. Poirot sat between Eleanor and Dr. Ransome, his plate barely touched. He watched carefully as glasses were filled and passed. He listened to the silence between words. When dessert was brought, steamed pudding with black treacle, Giles Merriman excused himself, citing a headache. Eleanor barely touched hers. Dr. Ransome took seconds. Poirot found it all very revealing. After the meal, as the others retreated to their rooms, Poirot walked alongside Inspector Gudgeon in the corridor. "You're forming a theory," Gudgeon said gruffly. "I am forming a conclusion," Poirot corrected. "I still think Eleanor Brent's our woman." "And I do not," said Poirot simply. "Too many eyes have been on her from the beginning." "No? The true killer thought themselves unseen." Gudgeon frowned. "You mean Merriman?" Poirot gave a small smile. "Non, mon ami. He is too proud. Too obvious. And too honest in his dislike. Then who? But Poirot only said, "We shall know tomorrow. Tonight, I advise you to sleep lightly." That night, the wind picked up again, shrieking down the chimneys like a cry of warning. Somewhere in the distance, a door slammed. The hall creaked and groaned with the memories of old things. And in his room, Poirot sat at his writing desk, pen poised above paper. He wrote a note to Inspector Gudgeon, folded it, and placed it beneath the door. Then he stood, walked to the window, and looked out over the moonlit garden. His eyes were fixed not on the stars, nor on the trees, but on the twisted hedges of the labyrinth, where the killer's shadow still lingered. Chapter 6, A Second Attempt. The morning after Miles Ashcombe's murder dawned with unnatural stillness. A frost had formed overnight, delicate and glittering, draping the garden like a veil of secrets. Ivy Hall, with its silent halls and tightly drawn curtains, seemed to hold its breath. Poirot was already awake, having slept little. He rose early, dressed immaculately in a navy blue suit with silver cufflinks, his own, of course, and made his way downstairs just as Vera was lighting the fire in the drawing room. "Ah, mademoiselle," he greeted softly. "It is a cold day. Has anything unusual occurred this morning?" Vera blinked, startled. "No, monsieur. Not that I've heard. Though Mr. Merriman was shouting in the motor garage just now. Something about sabotage." Poirot's moustache twitched. "Merci." He stepped outside into the cold, crisp air, following the gravel path toward the detached motor house at the rear of the property. A light plume of smoke puffed from the chimney above it, and a heated argument filtered through the door. Inside, Giles Merriman stood with a spanner in one hand and an oil-stained rag in the other, glaring at the engine of Lady Cecily's silver touring car. "I told you someone's tampered with it," he growled to Inspector Gudgeon, who had arrived moments before. "These brake lines were sliced clean, and recently, too." Poirot stepped in. "Comment?" "The brakes." Gudgeon turned. "You heard right. Someone cut the brake cables on Lady Cecily's car. If she'd taken it out this morning, as she usually does for church, she'd have been halfway down the hill before discovering she couldn't stop." "Mon Dieu," Poirot said softly. "It is a second attempt, then. Not merely murder, but murder planned. Calculated. And executed with cowardice." Lady Cecily was summoned immediately and was visibly shaken when told. "But why me?" she whispered. "Why would anyone wish me gone?" Poirot met her eyes gravely. "Perhaps not you, precisely, madam. But what you represent. The key to the estate. The past. The truth." She blinked. "The truth?" Poirot did not elaborate. He simply turned to Gudgeon. "No more accidents must occur. Until this matter is resolved, I suggest Lady Cecily remain inside the house. And someone should watch over her at all times." "I'll see to it," Merriman said, jaw tight. "No," Poirot said sharply. "It must be someone with no reason to act in her harm. Miss Brent, if you would." Eleanor looked startled but nodded. "Of course." Poirot gave a crisp nod. "Good. Now, if you will excuse me, I have one more visit to make before luncheon." An hour later, Poirot arrived at the local solicitor's office in the nearby village of West Dean. The building was modest, stone-fronted with a brass plate by the door reading Harcourt and Fox, Estate Law. The junior solicitor, a tidy young man with round spectacles, greeted Poirot with polite surprise. "Monsieur Poirot." "Of course. Yes, I handled Lady Cecily's most recent testament." Is there something I can help you with? Poirot leaned forward. I wish to know, has anyone else in Ivy Hall altered their will in the past year? The solicitor pursed his lips. Normally I could not say. But under the circumstances, and given your standing, yes. One additional party. Miss Eleanor Brent. Poirot nodded. To whom did she leave her estate? A charitable trust. The Brighton Home for Orphan Girls. She removed the original beneficiary, Mr. Miles Ashcombe, entirely. Interesting, Poirot murmured. And no other family members, living or otherwise, have made inquiries about inheritance, entitlements, or property. The solicitor hesitated. There was one, about 8 months ago. A man claiming to be a distant Ashcombe relation, on the illegitimate side. He called himself Gerald Gerald Ransome. Or Ramsden. Something of that sort. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Did he present any credentials? No. He made some inquiries, asked if he might have a claim should Lady Cecily pass away without a direct heir. I told him it was unlikely. Poirot nodded slowly, rose, and extended his hand. You have been most helpful, monsieur. Merci. Back at Ivy Hall, Poirot found the household assembled once again in the drawing room, Inspector Gudgeon overseeing the questioning of Giles Merriman. I didn't even know the car was to be used today, Merriman insisted. Why would I sabotage it? I've been here 20 years. Poirot raised his hand. Non, Inspector. You waste time. This man is not our culprit. Gudgeon bristled. You have proof. Poirot turned to Lady Cecily. Madam, do you recall the photograph in your study? The one of your late husband as a young man, with his hunting party. She frowned. Yes, it hangs beside the bookcase. May I show it to everyone? She nodded, puzzled. Poirot left the room and returned a moment later with the framed photograph. He held it up for all to see, a young Lord Ashcombe, posed in tweeds, one hand resting on the shoulder of a slender boy, perhaps 16, dark-haired, with a sharp nose and proud eyes. Poirot pointed to the boy. This, he said, is Gerald Ashcombe, the illegitimate son. You may not recognize him now, but I do. He turned slowly. It is Dr. Ransome. Gasps echoed across the room. Ransome rose to his feet, his voice taut. That's ridiculous. I'm not. You are, Poirot interrupted. I know now that Gerald Ashcombe disappeared for years. Re-emerged under a different name. You came here not just as a doctor, but as a man with a plan. Ransome's lips thinned. Poirot stepped closer. You discovered that your half-brother stood to inherit everything. You despised him, for his entitlement, his cruelty. Perhaps you feared your past would never be acknowledged. So you took matters into your own hands. You can't prove this, Ransome said tightly. I do not need to, Poirot replied. Because you will. Tomorrow morning, I will gather this household one final time. And then, messes it mesdames, I shall lay bare every secret. He looked at each face, one by one. The killer believed themselves clever. But Hercule Poirot, he is cleverer still. And with that, he left the room, the hem of his coat whispering against the floor like a promise of justice. Chapter 7, A Tangle of Lies. Twilight settled over Ivy Hall like a velvet shroud, wrapping the ancient estate in silence and shadow. The fires crackled low in the hearths, casting flickering amber light against the oak-panelled walls. The household had grown hushed and tense, as though the very stones of the manor were listening. In the drawing room, Hercule Poirot sat alone, deep in contemplation. The events of the last few days coiled through his mind like threads in a tangled skein: the suspicious death of Miles Ashcombe, the tampered motorcar, the laudanum, the concealed identity of Dr. Ransome. There were still questions that refused to align neatly. The truth, he knew, was close. But there remained one final step, the understanding not merely of action, but of intent. Murder, for Poirot, was never just the act. It was the psychology behind it that revealed the criminal. And so, he would draw the threads tighter. Poirot began his evening with Giles Merriman. He found the estate manager in the conservatory, hunched over a small desk with a sheaf of accounts. The last light of day made his grey hair glow faintly gold. "Monsieur Merriman," Poirot said quietly, "I wish to speak frankly. You are a man of loyalty. You have served this household long." Merriman looked up warily. "Is this a polite way of saying I'm too old-fashioned to commit murder?" "No," Poirot replied, "it is my way of saying I do not believe you would kill for gain. But you would protect those you care about." Merriman stiffened. "You're speaking of Eleanor?" Poirot nodded. "You knew she once loved Miles. You also knew he hurt her." Merriman's jaw clenched. "He ruined her. Not with scandal, but with coldness. She adored him. He played with her like a child with a toy, then cast her aside. She never recovered." "Did you love her?" Poirot asked gently. Merriman gave a bitter smile. "Still do." Poirot placed a hand on his shoulder. "I believe you, monsieur. But love does not always lead to murder." Next, Poirot sought out Eleanor Brent. She was in the music room, seated at the grand piano, her fingers ghosting over the ivory keys though no sound emerged. Her expression was far away, as if she had long ago floated beyond the walls of the house. "Mademoiselle," Poirot said softly, "I must ask you once more, what did you hear the night Miles died?" She looked up, startled, then gathered herself. A voice. A man's voice. Angry. I was in bed, half asleep. I remember the tone more than the words. "Did you recognize it?" She hesitated. "I thought at the time it might be Miles, arguing with someone. But now I think it may have been Dr. Ransome." "Gerald Ashcombe," Poirot corrected gently. She looked away. "He deceived us all." Poirot watched her carefully. "But did you ever suspect his interest in you might have been more than professional?" Eleanor flushed. "I trusted him. He was kind. He listened. After Miles, it felt like a lifeline. But now, knowing who he really is," her voice faltered. "It's terrifying." "Do not be afraid," Poirot said quietly. "The truth will defend you." Poirot's third conversation was with Dr. Ransome himself. The doctor, Gerald Ashcombe, stood in the library, arms folded, defiant but cornered. There was no longer any trace of charm in his face, only calculation. "You have no proof," he said coldly. "A photograph means nothing." "It means something," Poirot said, unshaken. "Enough to raise the question. And that is all I need, for now." Ransome smirked. "And what then? You think this was about inheritance? Revenge? Please. Miles was a parasite. He wasted everything he touched. The world is better without him." Poirot raised a brow. "Ah, but there it is. You admit your hatred." "I didn't say I killed him." "You didn't have to," Poirot said softly. "Hatred, monsieur, is never a silent partner. He stepped closer. You played your part very well. A concerned doctor, a polite guest. You even manipulated Eleanor's emotions, clever, cruel. But you made one mistake. And what's that? Poirot smiled faintly. You thought you were the only one with secrets. Ransome narrowed his eyes, but Poirot said nothing more. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving the doctor to fume in the darkening room. That night, a final discovery changed everything. Poirot had requested the key to the old gardener's lodge, long disused and boarded up near the edge of the property. The door groaned open under Merriman's hand, revealing dust-covered furniture and long-forgotten tools. But Poirot was looking for something more recent. He found it in the hearth, a charred pile of paper fragments. Not old kindling. Not trash. Burned letters. Carefully, using tweezers from his pocket, Poirot lifted one half-intact scrap. The handwriting was sharp and elegant. A single name survived on the edge of the paper. Gerald. Another bore the Ashcombe seal. He stood, eyes narrowing. He destroyed the proof. But too late. Back inside the manor, Poirot made his final preparations. He returned to his room, where the envelope with Gudgeon's note still lay unopened. Instead, he sat at his small desk and retrieved a folded sheet of paper from his inner pocket. It was a list. A final inventory of truth. Motive: Gerald Ashcombe, illegitimate son, disinherited and denied. Means: a sundial fragment, a convenient weapon. Gloves found in the shed. Opportunity: a secret entrance to the maze via the old gardener's shed. Cover: a false identity, a doctor's calm facade, and misdirection toward Eleanor. Mistake: a broken cufflink and a burned letter not fully destroyed. Poirot closed the notebook. Tomorrow, the final curtain would rise. And with it, the killer would fall. Chapter 8, Poirot Speaks. The drawing room at Ivy Hall was silent but for the ticking of the grandfather clock and the low crackle of the fire. The household had assembled at Poirot's request, seated with tense expressions and wary glances. No one knew quite what to expect, only that the great detective had promised to reveal everything. Poirot stood by the hearth, a small figure of precision and elegance. His suit was dark, his patent shoes gleamed, and his moustaches were, as always, immaculate. Mesdames et messieurs, he began, his tone calm but commanding, we are gathered here because a man is dead, another nearly was, and a house once filled with respectability now groans under the weight of suspicion. But today, la vérité, the truth, shall be known. He clasped his hands behind his back and began to pace slowly. You all knew Miles Ashcombe. Some loved him once. Most despised him later. But one among you hated him enough to kill. And not only him. That person also made a second attempt, this time on Lady Cecily, by tampering with her motorcar. A murmur stirred the room. Lady Cecily's fingers clenched around her shawl. Poirot turned. But to understand the crime, we must first understand the criminal. For murder is not just a matter of means or opportunity, it is a matter of motive. He paused beside Dr. Felix Ransome. Or, should I say, Gerald Ashcombe. Ransome stiffened, but said nothing. Poirot addressed the room. This man is not who he claimed to be. He is the illegitimate son of the late Lord Ashcombe, conceived in scandal, hidden in shame. But he did not forget. And when he grew into a man, he found his way here, under a false name, determined to reclaim what he believed was owed to him. Lady Cecily stared. Then it was true, he was Gerald. Yes, madam. You saw it yourself, in the photograph. I confirmed it in the village solicitor's records. Gerald Ashcombe made inquiries months ago. But when he realized he had no legal claim to the estate, he took another route. Poirot paced again, his voice gaining momentum. Miles was the legitimate heir. Cruel, greedy, self-serving, but legitimate. Gerald hated him, not just for the inheritance, but for what he represented, legitimacy, recognition, and the life Gerald was denied. Poirot stopped near the fireplace. So Gerald devised a plan. He became Dr. Ransome. Respectable, calm, trusted. He manipulated Eleanor's affections, indebted himself to Lady Cecily, and gained access to the inner workings of the household. He bided his time. Poirot pointed to the broken cufflink he now held between gloved fingers. This, I found near Miles' body in the labyrinth. A piece of vanity, silver, with a blue stone. The other one, I saw earlier, was worn by Dr. Ransome. Ransome's jaw tightened. It proves nothing. No? Poirot replied. Then allow me to continue. He turned to Vera, seated quietly near the door. Mademoiselle Vera saw you burning letters in the study. Letters which would have confirmed your identity, letters from Lady Cecily's late husband. And when you realized someone had seen you, you threatened her into silence. Vera nodded, eyes wide. I didn't know what they were, she said. But he said if I ever spoke, he'd ruin me. Poirot gave a small, sad smile. A bully, like your brother. He stepped closer to the center of the room. The night Miles died, he was lured into the maze. Gerald forged a note, one appearing to be from Eleanor, requesting a meeting there. Miles followed. Gerald entered the maze via the gardener's shed, through a hidden gap in the hedge known only to those who explored the grounds as children. There, at the center, he struck Miles from behind with a piece of broken sundial. Poirot's voice dropped to a whisper. It was not passion. It was preparation. He even wore gloves, found in the shed, still stained with blood. Gudgeon stepped forward. We'll go check it now. Poirot nodded, then turned back to the group. But Gerald's crime did not stop there. Fearing that Lady Cecily would grow suspicious, or revise her will, he tampered with her motorcar's brakes, hoping her death would appear tragic but accidental. It failed, but the intent was clear. Lady Cecily gasped. I gave you my trust. Gerald stood abruptly. This is nonsense. You have no proof, only theories and guesses. No, monsieur, Poirot said calmly. I have evidence. A letter fragment from the gardener's lodge, where you tried to destroy your past. And I have your own mistake, speaking of Eleanor's inheritance, which was never public knowledge. You knew too much. Dr. Ransome, Gerald, stood motionless. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was mine by right, he said coldly. You think I wanted money? No. I wanted what I was denied. A name. A place. That estate should have passed to me. But instead, it went to him, that arrogant little thief who drank and gambled and treated women like game. His eyes turned to Eleanor. I only wanted you to see me as better than him. But even you, he trailed off. Eleanor rose, pale but firm. You were better. Until you killed. Inspector Gudgeon stepped forward. Dr. Felix Ransome, also known as Gerald Ashcombe, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Miles Ashcombe and attempted murder of Lady Cecily Ashcombe. As he was led away, Gerald gave one final look to Poirot. You're wrong, you know, he said. If I'd had the name Ashcombe from the start, I'd never have needed to kill. Poirot met his gaze, unflinching. "Non, monsieur. You would have found another excuse. It is not the name that defines a man, but his choices." Later that evening, the storm had passed, and calm returned to Ivy Hall. Poirot took his tea in the library, a blanket across his knees and a small, satisfied smile upon his lips. Lady Cecily joined him, placing a hand on his arm. "How can I ever thank you, Monsieur Poirot?" "You already have, madam," he replied. "By surviving." She sat beside him, her voice tinged with sorrow. "He fooled us all. Even me." Poirot nodded. "That is the danger of grief left unspoken. It breeds shadows. But now, the truth has cleared them." Eleanor entered a moment later, smiling faintly. "The maze looks so peaceful now," she said. "Strange, how something so twisted could feel safe again." Poirot sipped his tea. "Because now, mademoiselle, you know your way out." And in the firelight of Ivy Hall, the great detective allowed himself a moment of peace, his work, for now, complete.